Okay, so this week we're talking about vocabulary. And this week marks a shift in our components of reading from learning to read to reading to learn. So we're making a jump from those words, learning to read words, to text sounds, read them fluently, and we're moving into using those words to build our comprehension, which is the ultimate goal of all of our reading. But this week we're focusing on vocabulary, and vocabulary is word knowledge. Okay, according to Stephen Stahl, who did a study in 2005, vocabulary knowledge is knowledge. The knowledge of a word not only implies a definition, but also implies how that word fits into the world. We develop vocabulary throughout our lives. So consider that this is not just for young kids, but for older kids and also adults. We are continually working on developing our vocabulary. And we use certain vocabularies in certain situations. Think about how you talk with your friends and the words that you use when you're addressing your friends. And then think about addressing an instructor. How do you speak to an instructor? And I'm sure that the vocabulary you use is different for each situation because vocabulary is situationally dependent. And what happens sometimes is that we don't know the right vocabulary to use in certain situations. So that's why we have a lifelong need to increase our vocabulary. Vocabulary knowledge varies greatly among learners. Gaps in vocabulary knowledge start before children go to school. So why do some children have a fuller, better vocabulary than other classmates? Well, it starts at home. Okay, so a home that is rich in language has lots of verbal stimulation. They have a wide variety of background experiences. Field trips are great, always. I'm a firm believer in field trips for building vocabulary because you learn things that are specific in that situation. They're read to at home. They read a lot independently. And they have an early development of word consciousness. So why do some students have a limited vocabulary? So the opposite would be true, right? A non-proficient student wouldn't be encouraged to read at home. They have limited exposure to books and limited exposure to experiences outside of their home. This happens a lot with people whose first language isn't English. They have experiences in their first language, but their second language, English, is much harder, and English is very tricky. You know, we don't always stick to an established set of rules. We know that vocabulary supports reading development and increases comprehension. Students with low vocabulary scores have low comprehension scores. So if they have high vocabulary scores, they have high comprehension scores. The National Reading Panel in 2000, National Reading Panel came out with all this reading stuff that we study, states that the complex process of comprehension is critical to the development of children's reading skills and cannot be understood without a clear understanding of the role of vocabulary development. So that is why vocabulary is one of the core components for comprehension. There are different types of vocabularies. We have a listening vocabulary. And that means when somebody says something to you, you understand what it means. You have a speaking vocabulary, and that's smaller. So think about somebody addressing you, talking to you, and you may understand what they mean, but you don't understand all the words that they have said. So if you're going to say something back to them, you don't use the same kind of words, right? You have a smaller speaking vocabulary. We have a reading vocabulary, and that's one of our bigger vocabularies once we become proficient at reading, because we understand words that we have read, but we don't always necessarily know how to say them aloud or know how they're pronounced correctly, so we don't say them aloud. So we have a bigger understanding of that. And our smallest vocabulary is our writing vocabulary. And those are words we know, understand, and can reproduce in our writing. So think about when you're doing a writing test or doing an essay, sometimes you choose words that you know how to spell as opposed to difficult words that you're not quite sure of. So, and then we teach vocabulary in different ways. The first way is incidentally. So students acquire vocabulary just by listening to people talk. So their exposure to words at home or at school, listening to people read aloud, they learn and get a sense of the word. We also teach intentionally, okay? But to go back to incidentally, most people, most people rely on reading to increase their incidental vocabulary learning. And studies show repeatedly that exposure to reading and spending time reading is the best way to build vocabulary and comprehension. Intentional vocabulary learning is something else that we do. And sometimes students need to be explicitly taught words. We can teach specific words to understand text or context or things like that. We can teach word learning strategies, so context clues that students can learn to use independently. And we can promote the development of word consciousness through wordplay, crossword puzzles, things like that. And some activities that we can do to help students increase their learning vocabulary is, first of all, to use student-friendly definitions. I mean, students have a hard time understanding just Googling a word and seeing how it works. You know, let's put that in some words we can all understand. Another activity would be defining words in context. So beat, the word beat, has B-E-A-T, has a couple definitions. You know, he got beat in the race. There was a beat to the song. So in the context, what does this word mean? Sketching words, drawing a visual for words is a great way to get students to understand the word. And another thing is analyzing word parts. Perhaps when you took the SAT or ACT, you studied what word parts were, like prefixes and suffixes and cores of the roots of the word, so that you could identify words that you didn't know what they were on those kind of tests. We can also teach students to do that in school so that they can look at words and figure them out without having to stop and look them up all the time. Vocabulary is a great core component, so this week should be pretty interesting. We do have spring break after this. Yay! So get all your work done early so you can get out of here early and not have to worry about fundamentals of reading over your break. Okay? I hope everybody has a good week this week, and I will talk to you again next week about assessments and I don't know, more things like that, definitions, what proficient students can do. I'll add that on next week. Everybody have a good week. Talk to you later. Bye.